may not happen. It didn't happen last year, and that's okay. The Lord knows. But I will say, as of this week, the idea of auditing the classes is a little bit different. I am going to enroll in some online classes with Crown. Some of you know my testimony that I left here, went to BBC, and while I was at BBC in college, there was a split of the college, and Heartland Baptist College started. And pretty quickly, BBC began to change. And I remember having a conversation with Don. I said, I don't know that I am going to want a diploma from this place after the way we were seeing things change. And so we left, we came back, got ordained, later got an associate's degree, but I would like to potentially finish up and get a bachelor's degree as well. And so I've talked to the administrators at Crown with my transcripts from BBC, plus some life experience credits from pastoring now for 19 years. I could over the next year or so possibly finish that out, and then later on, if I want to try more online classes to go towards a master's, I can do that. But with what I have, it really wouldn't be that hard to go ahead and get that next degree. And so I would like to try to do that if I can do some of it online, just at my own pace, as far as not taking 18, 20 hours like you do when you're on campus at a college, but just doing a couple classes here and there to get that. And so initially I talked about auditing some classes, but it's a lot easier if I can do it and get the credit for it as well and complete those things. I don't want all of my kids getting their bachelor's before I get mine. So gotta get a little competitive now that they're getting older. Use that as motivation, right? But anyway, but all that, most of that I would be able to do here. But one of the things we had talked about in there was possibly doing some in-person things during that summer. All right, Judges chapter 8 is where we're at. I might have to keep stepping back tonight. I left my reading glasses at home, and my arms aren't long enough. So I'll probably keep moving back and forwards depending upon what I'm reading. If I'm reading verses or reading from my iPad. The iPad, I can make the text as big as I want, so you'll see me scrolling a lot. I have to have it at size 18 font on this thing today. So, but Judges chapter 8, we've been the last few weeks looking at the story of Gideon. And there's something in us that loves like a good hero story. We love the story of David and Goliath, and even in our world, growing up, I loved watching movies like Rudy, Hoosiers. I loved watching Hoosiers, and this week our basketball team for our school gets to go play on the court where they filmed the movie Hoosiers, and I was so excited about it, and I was quickly reminded how old I am. All the guys on our basketball team is like, what's that? They'd never even heard of the movie Hoosiers. And so we got all of them coming over to my house tomorrow night to watch Hoosiers so they can know what they're walking into. But I love stories like that. We all love a good underdog story. We love the one who fights when no one else will fight. We love the stories where God takes a weak person and uses them to defeat the mighty people. And that's the story of Gideon in Judges chapter 6 and chapter 7. Really one of the more inspiring characters in the Bible. He goes from hiding in a wine press, doubting God's call, and asking for signs, and then saying, okay, with that sign, let me ask for another sign. He goes from that to leading 300 men, we looked at last week, and going against 135,000 Midianites. And God strips the army down to nothing so that when the victory happens, everybody knows it came from God. And Gideon becomes the hero of Israel. But when we get to chapter 8, something begins to happen that is kind of sobering in this story. The man who fought right, who trusted God, and saw miraculous victories begins to drift a little bit here. And look, in life, it's not enough to start right. We need to finish right. I remember one of the messages that Pastor Sheffield preached in his last year of pastoring, when he had told me, he said, I want to try to prepare the church for it. He said, I spent years telling the church I'll never retire. And he said, I want to kind of prepare them for the fact that, that has changed now. And I remember one of the messages that he preached talking about wanting to finish the race. and to finish strong in that and to not fail in the fourth quarter of life. And that has always stuck with me, that I've watched many people do that over the years. They have stood for the Lord, and we would say sometimes, well, they mellowed out as they got older. But man, when I see people, and I'm not talking about being abrasive, I'm just meaning to stand on the Word of God throughout our life and finish right. But a lot of people, they start humble, they start faithful, they start dependent on God, and God starts blessing, and somewhere along the way, they start thinking they've earned those blessings. They start getting a little prideful. They forget where they came from. And when that happens, the very victory that God gave them becomes the thing that destroys them. Now, we're not going to read all the way through the chapter at one time. We're going to break it up tonight as we read. So let's start here in verse 1. It says, "The men of Ephraim said to him, Why hast thou served us thus, that thou callest us not when thou wentest to fight with the Midianites? And they did chide with him sharply." So first we see that right after this greatest victory of his life, Gideon faces his biggest challenge, and it's not the Midianites. It's his people. Sometimes success will bring some new battles. At first, he's so concerned about taking on the Midianites, but now it's the people there with him. Verses 2 and 3, it says, "He said unto them, What have I done now in comparison to you? Is not the gleaning of the grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer? God hath delivered into your hands the princes of Midian, Oreb, and Zeb, and what was I able to do in comparison of you, that their anger was abated toward him when he had said this?" So the Midianites, they're defeated. Now he's facing this enemy, this jealous people. So the tribe of Ephraim comes to him, and they're mad. And they're like, "Why didn't you invite us to this battle?" Really what they're wanting is, we would like some of this credit as well. Victory has a way of revealing people's hearts. When things are going well, people sometimes think when things are struggling, that's when you really find out who people are. Sometimes when things are going well, you really find out who people are. Some people cannot stand to watch somebody else get used by God. They've got to try to poke holes in that. And Gideon has a wise response. He says, "What have I now in comparison of you? Is not the gleaning of grapes of Ephraim better than the vintage of Abiezer?" He handles this moment perfectly. He humbles himself. Instead of saying, "Look, I defeated 135,000 soldiers with 300 men. I didn't need you. You could have been here. I didn't need you. We did it without you." In his pride, he could have done that. But he says, "What you've done is even greater than what I've done." And the Bible says that their anger was abated toward him. It means they dropped their anger. That's wisdom here. Proverbs teaches that a soft answer turneth away wrath. You ever found yourself in that moment where you have a great comeback, and the Lord is telling you, a soft answer turneth away wrath. And you're like, "Yeah, but I want to turn away cheeks right now. I'm not looking at turning away wrath. I want to smack somebody with the truth. I want to just say something that is just going to crush them in this moment." And sometimes the most spiritual thing you can do is be quiet and simply refuse to fight the fight. Not every criticism of you needs a defense. Not every accusation needs a summit and a speech. Sometimes the best answer is humility. I think it was Spurgeon that said something along the lines is when somebody criticizes him, I basically tell him, "You don't know the half of it." When somebody criticizes you, they're probably right anyway. So instead of trying to defend yourself, just be humble. But the story's not finished here. The real problem in Judges chapter 8 is not Ephraim. The real problem is what begins to happen here in Gideon's heart. So verse 4 says, "Gideon came to Jordan and passed over, he and the 300 men that were with him, faint, yet pursuing them." Notice that phrase, faint, yet pursuing. They were exhausted. They've been fighting all night. They've been chasing these enemies for miles. They were physically drained, and fatigue can be one of the more dangerous moments in the Christian life. You know how many people have quit the ministry, quit what God's called them to do, quit their jobs, quit on their families because they're tired. They're just exhausted. And in their emotion and in their frustration, they've just quit. In your tired, fatigue moments, your patience begins to disappear. Your emotions start working in overdrive. And anybody that says, well, I'm not an emotional person, you're probably a lot more emotional than you think you are. Now, you may not be driven by the emotions, but we all have those emotions. And a lot of times in that fatigue, our discernment starts to weaken. We start to make quicker decisions. We start to make brash and emotional decisions. And many believers, I believe, make their worst decisions while they're exhausted. Some say, I can't make decisions when I'm not exhausted because I'm always exhausted. If I can't make decisions while I'm exhausted, I would never get to make a decision. But sometimes that's part of our problem in our life is we need to, I've heard the phrase for years, sometimes we got to come apart before we come apart. Like we've got to take that time to rest because exhaustion causes a lot of problems. And so now we're going to read a chunk of verses here starting in verse 5 down through verse 17, and we see the bitterness begin to grow in Gideon. So he said to the men of Succoth, give, I pray you, loaves of bread unto thy people, to people that follow me, for they be faint, and I am pursuing after Zebah and Zalmunna, kings of Midian. And the princes of Succoth said, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in thine hand, that we should give bread unto thine army? And Gideon said, therefore, when the Lord hath delivered Zebah and Zalmunna into mine hand, then I will tear your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness and with the briars. And he went up thence to Peniel and spake unto them likewise. And the men of Peniel answered him as the men of Succoth had answered him. And he spake also unto the men of Peniel, saying, when I come again in peace, I will break down this tower. Now Zebah and Zalmunna were in Karkor, and their hosts with them, about 15,000 men, all that were left of all the hosts of the children of the east. For there fell 120,000 men that drew sword. Gideon went up by the way of them that dwelt in the tents of the east of Nobah and Jogbeah, and smote the host, for the host was secure. And when Zebah and Zalmunna fled, he pursued after them, and took the two kings of Midian, Zebah and Zalmunna, and discomfited all the host. And Gideon the son of Joash returned from the battle before the sun was up, and caught a young man of the men of Succoth, and inquired of him. And he described unto him the princes of Succoth, and the elders thereof, even 70 men. And he came unto the men of Succoth and said, behold, Zebah and Zalmunna, with whom ye did upbraid me, saying, are the hands of Zebah and Zalmunna now in thine hand, that we should give bread unto thy men that are weary? And he took the elders of the city, and the thorns of the wilderness, and the briars, and with them he taught the men of Succoth. And he beat down the tower of Peniel, and slew the men of the city. So Gideon, he asked these two Israeli cities for help, Succoth and Peniel. And he asked for something simple. We're tired. Can we get some bread? And they refuse, and they say to them essentially, we're not helping you unless we know you win. They're cowards. They're saying, we don't want to make the Midianites mad by helping you. So how do we know you're going to win? So when you have them in your hand, then we'll give you some bread. And Gideon responds. He had responded with humility in verse 1. Here he responds with anger. It says, when the Lord hath delivered Zebah and Zalmunna into thine hand, then I will tear your flesh with the thorns of the wilderness. And later he comes back and does just that. He whips the elders of Succoth with thorns. He tears down the tower of Peniel, and he kills the men of the city. Now understand, their refusal to help him was wrong. But Gideon's response is troubling. The man who once said, if the Lord is with us, we could do it, now is saying, if you won't help me, I will tear you apart. And he's no longer saying, well, I've got the Lord, that's enough. He's saying, if you don't help me, I will tear you apart. And in fact, he's beginning to say, they're delivered into my hand, starting to add just a little bit of that, inserting himself into that. Something's changed. The language is changing. The focus is changing. The victory is becoming his victory instead of God's victory. And that's how pride starts to begin in our life. And so it doesn't usually start with some loud declaration. It begins with this subtle shift of thinking that you're owed recognition or that you're owed something. You go from God did this to I did this. And that personal revenge begins to take over. In verse 18 it says, then said he unto Zebah and Zalmunna, what manner of men were they whom ye slew at Tabor? And they answered, as thou art. so were they. Each one resembled the children of a king. And he said, they were my brethren, even the sons of my mother. As the Lord liveth, if ye had saved them alive, I would not slay you. And he said unto Jether, his firstborn, up and slay them. But the youth drew not his sword, as he feared, because he was yet a youth. And he says then in verse 21, and then Zebah and Zalmunna said, rise thou and fall upon us, for as the man is, so is his strength. And Gideon arose and slew Zebah and Zalmunna, and took away the ornaments that were on their camel's neck. And so he has these two kings, and we learned something in this situation here, that they had previously killed his brothers. It says they were my brethren, even the sons of my mother. So suddenly now we're seeing a different motive. This is no longer about delivering Israel. This is about his personal revenge. Gideon says, as the Lord liveth, if you had saved them, I would not slay you. And he kills them. Now again, these were enemy kings. But the text is showing us something. The one who once fought for God's glory is now doing it for personal vengeance. And revenge is a dangerous thing. Romans chapter 12, verse 19 says, vengeance is mine, I will repay, saith the Lord. When we take vengeance into our own hands, we're stepping into the place of what belongs to God. And so Gideon now, he says to his son, you do it. Son said, he's a kid, he doesn't want to do it. So finally, Gideon stands up and slays the two men. And he's gotten his personal revenge on them. And he says here in verse 22, then the men of Israel said to Gideon, rule thou over us, both thou and thy son's sons also, for thou hast delivered us from the hand of Midian. And Gideon said to them, I'll not rule over you, neither shall my son rule over you. The Lord shall rule over you. So they want him to become a king. They want him to set up a dynasty and a monarchy. And he says something that sounds incredibly spiritual. He says, I'm not going to rule over you. The Lord will rule over you. And doesn't that sound like the perfect answer? The words are right. It sounds humble, sounds godly, but what Gideon does next reveals some problems. It says, Gideon said unto them, I would desire a request of you, that you would give me every man the earrings of his prey, for they had golden earrings, because they were Ishmaelites. And they answered, we will willingly give them. And they spread a garment and did cast therein every man the earrings of his prey. And the weight of the golden earrings that he requested was 1,700 shekels of gold, beside ornaments and collars and purple raiment that was on the king of Midian, and besides the chains that were about their camel's neck. And Gideon made an ephod thereof, and put it in his city, even in Ophrah. And all Israel went thither a-whoring after it, which thing became a snare unto Gideon and to his house. He said, I want the spoils of the war, the gold earrings, and it gathered 1,700 shekels of gold. That's about, I had to look that up, that's about 40 to 50 pounds of gold. And Gideon makes this ephod. An ephod is a priestly garment of worship. And Gideon places it in his hometown. And the Bible says something tragic there when it says, all Israel went thither a-whoring after it. It becomes an idol. The man who destroyed the idols of Baal is now making an idol that all Israel is going to have as a snare. You don't have to build a golden calf to have an idol. An idol is anything that you allow to take the place of God. For some people that might be success, it might be a reputation, it might be influence, it might be money, it might be a position or ministry. It can sometimes even be family. And sometimes one of our greatest idols is our own legacy, what we want to be remembered as. Gideon said, I won't be a king. But we find out he lived as a king. He lived like one. So he didn't want the title, I won't rule over you, but then he ends up living like a king. In verse 29 says, Jerubbaal the son of Joash went and dwelt in his own house, and Gideon had 70 sons. Think about that for a moment. 70 sons of his body begotten, for he had many wives. And his concubine that was in Shechem, she also bare him a son, whose name was called Abimelech. And Gideon, the son of Joash, died in good old age and was buried in the sepulchre in Joash his father and Ophrah and the Abiezerites. So he has 70 sons and many wives. He began living just like the pagan kings did of their day. And that name Abimelech, if you look it up in Hebrew, the name Abimelech, what it means is, my father is king. He was living as a king. And guess who Abimelech became? He became one of the most violent tyrants in Israel's history. That was the end result. That is Gideon's legacy in a way that he left. Man, he had done so many great things over those years, but then he builds his ephod, and the people are going after it, treating it as an idol, and he lives as a king, and he dies in verse 33, and the nation falls right back into idolatry. It says in verse 33, and it came to pass as soon as Gideon was dead, that the children of Israel turned again and went a-whoring after Balaam and after Baal-berith, their god. So while to them, when you're following this idol all along, it's not a hard jump to just go to some other false god as soon as Gideon died. Yes, you remember the good old days when Gideon saved you from the Midianites in your mind. You've forgotten that it was God, and you're thinking this ephod is something that you need to go after. Why? Because Gideon made it. No, but they forgot who God was, and immediately after Gideon died, they go straight, not just back to the ephod, now they're going to Balaam and these false gods. Because Gideon never truly removed the idol that he created. And one generation's compromise has become the next generation's corruption. We still see it in every generation. The compromises of my generation are leading to the corruptions of the next generation. The corruptions of my generation were brought upon by the compromises of the previous generation. And we just keep falling into, we say, man, Israel, all throughout Judges, we keep seeing this cycle. We keep seeing this cycle in America as well. Except we don't really have much of a return to God every time. But we sometimes might have a little bit more morality uptick in our country at certain times. But then we just continually following after entertainment, pleasure, and success and money and all these things. You know, Gideon didn't wake up. We got to remind ourselves, one thing we can learn from Gideon is that victory can sometimes be more dangerous than defeat. Because when victory lifts us up in pride, it is far worse than a defeat that makes us humble. And victory can sometimes be such a huge problem in our life. For one, many believers pray harder in crisis than they do in success. So when they're successful, prayer is not as important to them. Victory inflates us, defeat humbles us. But also we have to realize that pride can sometimes grow very slowly. Like, I don't think Gideon woke up one day and was like, I think I'm going to ruin my legacy. You know what, I want to defeat the Midianites so I can be living as the top guy here in Israel. I don't think he did that. I think that with victory came a little bit further steps of going away from humility and building that pride in his life. I think it happened gradually. A little credit here, opportunities to get revenge here, a little recognition from people here, getting a little more compromise, a little bit more financial wealth. But I believe that finishing well is something we ought to far more celebrate than those who start well. I remember we went to, me and Don went to a pastor's and pastor's wife retreat. And this would have been in about, I don't know, maybe 2009, somewhere in there. And we went to this retreat, and there was a array of pastors there. There were guys like Don Cheshire and Don Whitecotton and Don Robinson and some of these guys who were older. And then there were a couple guys, and I know most of them, you all don't know who those guys are, but they're old enough now that most of them are with the Lord now that were in that group. But then there were some young guys, and it was sad. Me and Don just sitting there, we were watching, and we were in the middle. Some of these guys were younger than us. A lot of the guys were older than us. So we're just kind of observing, and it was really weird the way things started happening. It was like everybody started like wanting to ask the younger guys, well, what are you doing for this? How do you do this? And what do you do that? And I'm thinking, what do they know? They've been pastoring like a year. I want to hear from these guys that have been pastoring for like 20, 30 years, asking them. But there were guys who were like the flash in the pan, and they had all these ideas. And man, everybody's like, oh, that just sounds so great. And man, we got to implement this and implement that. And then on the last day that we were there, one of the younger guys, he finally asked a question of the older guys. And he began to talk, and he said, after everybody thought that everything he was talking about, church work and church ministry, was so golden, he said, I've been at this church for 3 years, and we still haven't seen a single person saved or baptized or even walk the aisle during a church service. And I remember thinking, now why are we listening to you? Not that that's the thing, but like we are acting as if you have all the answers, and God is not seeming to bless that. But meanwhile, these guys that have been faithful for years, we see somebody with all the charisma and energy coming in, and they're like that flash in the pan, and we think, man, that's exciting. But I'm so much more thankful for those who finished well, that I've been able to watch over the years, who have served, and we can look back at their ministry. And I know sometimes that's hard, because you always go, well, hey, if they're still alive, they still have more time to ruin that legacy. And sometimes people really can ruin it at the very end of their life. But man, I've been so thankful over the years. I've been blessed to have known several men that even years after they were gone, we'd still be able to look back at their legacy and say, man, they ran the race. They finished the course. They didn't just sprint out of the gate and then fizzle out. But the only way you can do that is to serve God in humility and continually put yourself at His beck and call, not striving to receive anything. Remember, Paul said, I have fought a good fight, finished my course. He didn't just mean I lived my life out. He said, I fought a good fight, kept the faith. It's a marathon, not a sprint. God used Gideon to defeat an army, but the story ends with idolatry and a corrupt son. Paul said, I finished. Now, some people here tonight, you may be like Gideon. You're early in life. God is working. God is doing something in your life. Man, that's awesome. God is using you. But be careful to not allow pride to creep in. I was telling somebody, I said, when I was a kid, I would preach here at the church, and I never thought I'd be able to come back as an adult. And I said, I never, and I don't mean this the wrong way, I never felt like anybody was listening to anything I said when I preached when I was a kid. They were just proud of me. They're like, this kid, he just got picked up in the Henson's car for years. He's coming to church. He's preaching. Man, that's nice. But they weren't learning anything. They weren't listening when I was preaching. They're just happy for me. And I don't mean that insulting. I just mean, like, usually I'd be preaching, and I'd preach a horrible sermon, and they'd come up and they go, oh, that was so good. And I'm like, man, you're lying like a good little Christian right there. They come and go, that was so good. And I remember years later coming back and people going, like, they'd taken notes and like actually learning something. And I remember that time, and it's easy in that moment to say, yeah, I did a good job there. Man, somebody told me that they learned something new in that message, and it's the pride can start creeping in if you're not careful. I remember Miss Hubbard, she had a really good way of making sure I stayed humble a lot of times after services. She'd come up to me and she'd say, that was a good little talk. I said, thanks, Miss Hubbard. She said, that was a good little talk. And my grandmother, such an encouragement, she missed a Sunday, and I said, Grandma, church was really good this week. She said, it's always good when I'm not there. And I said, thanks, Grandma. I love you too. You got to have some people in your life help you stay humble, right? But man, it is so easy. Sometimes when people are being nice and encouraging us in our Christian walk, it's easy to turn that into pride and say, yeah, see, I'm doing good. God is using me. God is doing this. And it's so easy to let that pride start creeping in. It is our responsibility. Christians should encourage one another. But it is our job as we're being encouraged to guard our own heart against those things. God will send encouragement at times when you need it. This last weekend, I had an email from a pastor. He said, hey, there's a lady at this nursing home a couple doors down from you that I'd like for you to visit. She's from our area. So I went down and visited her. And while walking through the nursing home, somebody recognized me and said, are you from around here? And I was thinking, do I want to answer this? I don't know where this is going. Come to find out 14 years ago, we were the foster parents for her little baby for 3 or 4 months. And some of the things she said that day were such an encouragement, right at a time when could really use that encouragement. But man, it's so we got to guard our heart then to not say, look at what we did. It's look at what God allowed to happen. That someone who right in a moment of need, God provided someone to be there for them. And that's God doing those things. We have to constantly fight that battle because we need encouragement, but we can't allow encouragement to become prideful to us. There might be those here, though, like I said, you're in that stage. Be careful, guard that. Maybe you're in that stage right now where you've allowed that to happen. You need to recognize it and repent of that. And say, Lord, I'm tired of seeking the credit that only you deserve. Gideon shows us something very sobering. He can defeat 135,000. God used him to defeat 135,000 Midianites, but he still lost the battle with his own heart. So you got to guard your heart. It's not about being strong. It's not about being crafty and conniving. It's about being humble and being faithful and being determined to say, by God's grace, I want to finish well. I want to finish well. I don't want, one day for a legacy to be tarnished by things that I did to get in the way. I just want to be able to say, people say, he served God. He loved the Lord. That should be every one of our testimony. It shouldn't just be testimonies that we remember of missionaries and preachers and evangelists. It should be every Christian. That should be our desire. To say, I just want to be remembered as one who loved the Lord and served him, and then that the Lord had his way in their life. Gideon teaches us a very sobering lesson. The question is, will we learn it and will we heed it? All right, we'll stop there and we'll move into chapter 9 in 2 weeks, looking at Abimelech. As I mentioned last week, this coming week, we will be heading out to take James to visit West Coast Baptist College. He's going to spend a few days in the dorms there and get a chance to just kind of see what the college life is like. And so pray for us for safety as we head out there, and that